privilege to be in this incredible building and to be asked to speak here today. I am accustomed to public speaking, but it's always made me incredibly nervous. And regardless of what Ian has just said, you're quite an intimidating audience. But despite my job, the only thing that really terrifies me is overhead lighting. So I want to say thank you very much, Ian, for the side lighting. The reason for that is, it's very germane to this audience, is years ago I was taking a press conference and I made a very beginner's error for both our professions. And I'd left my phone switched on. Now, every police officer who appears on television is immediately bombarded by all their friends thinking they must have kept the phone on. My youngest son was quickest to the draw, and he sent me a text. My second beginner error was actually looking at the text. And he said, "Dad, step away from the light. You're beginning to look like a giant speaking Malteser." You won't remember any of the speech apart from that. I am grateful for the invitation, Ian. It does feel a little bit like a right to reply. When I agreed to speak today, of course, an election wasn't in any of our minds and hadn't been called, but even at a very political time, I thought it was important to be here. I hope you'll also understand that because of that, I am slightly limited in what I can say in the speech and in the Q&A that will follow. But I would love to have a fuller debate with anybody who wants it at any time, in private, after the election, and my door is always open. Some may see it as a slightly delicious irony that I've been heavily censored by my own communications team because of that. I am going to try and describe to you what the world looks like from where I stand, how I need your help and support to keep people safe, and what that might actually mean, and how I suspect journalists and police officers are a lot more alike than perhaps even we realise. So, an interesting fact for you. I grew up not wanting to be an astronaut or a train driver or even a police officer. I wanted to be a journalist, specifically a war correspondent. I was way too shy to pursue that as a career at the time. But my two big heroes were Woodward and Bernstein. I am older than I look, particularly if you've looked at the photograph in this. That's my PA. It's the only photograph she likes of me. The Met's own head of media said, "You look 20 years younger." I'm 10 years younger, not 20 years younger, but that's why no one ever recognises me. But I would have been rubbish as a journalist, and I know that. So I'm lousy at deadlines. I'm very long-winded, and I'm afraid I'm about to prove that to you now. I'm in awe, however, of many of our great investigative journalists and war correspondents. Extraordinary people doing extraordinary work. And at our best, journalists and cops are tenacious investigators. We both need to get to the heart of what happened when things go wrong, and we both need to make sure that the right people are held to account for their actions. We are truth seekers on behalf of the public, and we exercise our duty, both of us, without fear or favour. Journalists can and do hold some of the country's most powerful individuals and organisations to account, quite rightly. Similarly, the police should be free to exercise our executive function independently, irrespective of the lawbreaker, fund manager or factory worker, corporation or private citizen. And of course, even when we need to, we must and do shine the light on ourselves. You and I both hold great power and shoulder great responsibility, and neither of us likes our expertise being called into question, still less our legitimacy. We both instinctively look after our own and can be tempted to close ranks when threatened. And as much as we try to plan ahead, so much of what we both do today is driven by events which move at a bewildering speed. We're both grappling with what rapid developments in technology and their profound impacts mean for our daily work. But I think we all want to do some good in this world. We want to maximise well-being. We want to minimise harm. We want to promote positive values and undermine evil ideology that attacks our way of life. I think we want to minimise the suffering of victims and survivors of crime and terrorism. We would rather celebrate the heroes who stopped it or who brought the offenders to justice. And there are always far more heroes to talk about than villains. As the person responsible for UK counter-terrorism policing, preventing suffering is all I am about. The last 4 years have been the most demanding the UK counter-terrorism history has seen since the mainland IRA bombing campaign of the 1970s. 2017 was by far our worst year. I'm sure we all remember it. I was the deputy then, first deputy to this role today. My illustrious predecessor, Sir Mark Rowley, was the head of counter-terrorism. And he gave me a very long job description. It runs to 3 or 4 pages, but I can crystallize it for you in one sentence. It is work with MI5 and stop terrorist attacks in the UK. And on my watch, there were 5 successful attacks, 36 people were murdered, and hundreds of people were damaged physically or mentally, many of them for life. I think about that fact every single day, and I say it every time I speak publicly. It's had a profound physical and mental effect on me. I'm very proud of our response to those attacks, and at the same time, we conducted the deepest review into the counter-terrorism machine in over a decade, committing to making real over 100 recommendations to make ourselves better. I'm most proud of the fact that together with MI5, we have disrupted 24 attack plots, 16 Islamist and 8 right-wing plots, and we've arrested and charged hundreds of terrorists. The outcome, and you'll have reported it recently, is the lowering of the terrorist threat level for the first time in 5 years. We still face a substantial threat, so an attack is still likely. We have 800 live investigations, more than double that of 2014. But it isn't the volume of the threat, it's the unpredictability and the lack of intelligence that creates the real pressure. Targets are softer, methodology is more simple and cheap, the perpetrators are either lone actors or talk to very few people or proficient in encryption. The attacks and the planning may be less frequent, but they are harder to see and therefore harder to stop. I'm particularly troubled by the rising nationalist agenda and a growth in what we now clearly see as right-wing terrorism. This trend was clearly defined by the watershed prescription of national action in December 2016 and is one that is being replicated throughout the world, Christchurch being the most egregious, but by no means the only example to date. That experience of working closely with victims, survivors and communities impacted by terrorism, standing in crime scenes, speaking to survivors, profoundly changes you. Everybody in this room knows that. In part, it's what drove the open letter I sent to support the New Zealand PM's approach and the plea by Brendan Cox for a different reporting style following that attack. It questioned the uncensored extremist propaganda that appeared in mainstream media. It challenged the journalistic interpretation of public interest. But my comments should be seen in the context I've described. Sympathy for what I've seen or heard or had to do is not asked for or expected any more than you would expect it. But an understanding of the context, I think we should agree, is important. In fact, the other thing I think about every single day is how to stop 2017 happening again. It's why I took this job. It's why I'll stay until I'm satisfied we have delivered those 100 plus recommendations and that we make the UK counter-terrorism machine better than ever. And believe me, it's world-class now. The other occasion that you and I fell out was more recently, during that leak investigation Ian mentioned into the UK ambassador to the United States reporting into government. I issued a statement advising that the publication of leaked communications may be a criminal matter under the Official Secrets Act, and advised that any such material should be returned. And subsequently, I was accused by some of seeking to undermine press freedom. I had my professional judgment questioned and contradicted by senior figures and was phoned directly by enraged editors. That was quite tough. My ears are still ringing from the experience. So 2 questions. Knowing what I know now, would I do it again? And the answer to that is yes. Knowing what I know now, would I have done it differently? The answer to that is yes. But context is crucial. Any police officer who is directly confronted with a plan to commit a criminal offence, one for which there is no defence in law, should expect to intervene. In fact, it would be professional negligence not to do so. The question here is how to intervene. And I could have picked up the phone to editors across Fleet Street. I had no idea if only one publication had the documents. I certainly now know that other journalists had been offered the story and had refused to print it. Would that have changed anything that subsequently happened? We don't know. I'm necessarily constrained in what more I can say because, of course, it's still a live investigation. And in an election period, I can't enter into a debate about the reform of the Official Secrets Act or its lack of a public interest defence, except to say that my comments are on record elsewhere on this point. And just like you, I strongly believe in a free press that holds power to account as a cornerstone of the strongest liberal democracy. It is a cornerstone, but it isn't the only one. As a cop, I firmly believe that the rule of law is another such cornerstone, and that keeps everyone in society safe, safe to enjoy rights, just like the right to free speech. I might even argue that it's not a cornerstone, but it's actually the foundation stone of a free and liberal democracy. And of course, I must take the law as I find it. I do regret the impact of my statement, not because of its effect on me, but because it risked damaging the relationship between policing and the media. As journalists, you occupy a crucial role in society that far transcends holding power to account. You have the ability to influence, contextualize, challenge, bear witness on behalf of the public, for the public. To cops, you are much more than an observer or a critic. You are a partner. The role of the media can make or break investigations, incidents, and careers. In that, I would include the most complex and difficult murder investigation of my career as a senior investigating officer, the double murder of Bertram Byfield and his 7-year-old daughter, Tony Ann, in 2003. These murders were cases of global notoriety, national significance, and real poignancy. There were no witnesses, no forensics, no clear suspects, but dozens of suspicious persons of interest. And it would never have been solved without the help of Crime Watch, the Liverpool Daily Echo, local radio in Merseyside, as well as the sympathetic coverage of the national media. I was then, and remain now, eternally grateful for that support. I probably wouldn't be standing here if it wasn't for you. No major inquiry or operation can deliver without the support of the media. And of course, no public body should consider themselves above scrutiny, especially the police, given the great powers we are given. We have emerged battered, bruised, but better because of your support to Stephen Lawrence's family, your push for the Macpherson inquiry, and for your campaign for the victims of Hillsborough. These are just examples amongst many demonstrating the pressure media can bring to bear on behalf of the public, pressure that ultimately improves society and its institutions for all of us. The importance of our partnership can't be overstated, and for it to continue to be effective, we need to understand each other and the context we operate in. I have spoken about the level of threat we face and the number of thwarted plots, but to me they always seem like goal line saves, and I want fewer goal line saves. It's why I speak publicly about the importance of prevent in the government's contest strategy, the importance of intervening early to stop people becoming terrorists in the first place, with a safeguarding, not a criminalising approach. And it's why we need the whole of society, including the media, to play its part. One model that merits a close look is the relationship you have built with the Samaritans in reporting suicide. It's a relationship that appears to me to be enduring, mutually beneficial, and practical. The way mainstream media has reported suicides in the last 20 years has changed on the basis of support provided by the Samaritans. The expertise they've shared with you on the effect of what you can do. As you are all aware, there is a potential for the reporting of a suicide to have an impact on audiences by increasing suicidal behaviour. It's known as suicide contagion. Samaritans and the World Health Organization report substantial research evidence showing the links between the media depiction of suicide and the spread of behaviour amongst vulnerable people. The risk of influencing suicide significantly increases if reports include descriptions of methods, if the story is placed prominently, and if the coverage is extensive or sensationalised. Samaritans have never suggested high-profile suicide should not be reported, only encouraged change on how they are reported. Coverage that can meet the public interest needs while minimising further harm is surely the best option. It's an option you've taken as an industry. And that positive relationship between Samaritans campaigners and the media has helped shape how suicide is reported, and it's almost certainly saved lives. Now, if reporting can be seen through that lens for suicide, then why not for terrorism? Yes, they're different phenomena, But what if it's the same psychological levers that can influence vulnerable people? If the evidence suggests that a person vulnerable to suicide thoughts can be motivated to act by the social proof and over-identification with a celebrity suicide, then could a person vulnerable to radicalization be triggered to act by the content of media reports describing terror? It would be wrong for me to stand here and make assertions based on speculation rather than evidence, and that's why I asked RUSI to investigate the scientific literature that might support such a theory, to better understand the relationship between terrorism and the traditional media. RUSI's emerging findings, which will be published in the coming months, are drawn from an extensive synthesis of the academic literature that exists to date, and they're citing over 120 expert sources. But it's a controversial topic. It's as controversial in academia as it would be to this room. RUSI's looked in depth at social contagion theory and whether media reporting of terrorist events encourages the spread of behavior among like-minded individuals. They've also investigated so-called mimetic theory, which suggests imitation of terrorist attacks might occur for the purpose of achieving the same publicity or recognition by carrying out similar attacks. RUSI's emerging findings suggest that how journalists frame their reports and the language they choose can have an impact, and there are steps which can be followed to reduce the impact and to mitigate what is referred to as the contagion effect. Indeed, the media can have a positive effect. By acting as peacemakers, by portraying terrorists as they truly are, they can heighten public awareness of security threats in a non-dramatic way. They can encourage public conversation and debate on the social and political implications of terrorism. And the literature is not conclusive. I don't seek to say that it is. There is disagreement in the academic community. RUSI did find significant empirical evidence that media report can be the tipping point to radicalization, recruitment, or carrying out a violent act through social contagion or so-called mimetic theory. But like all the big social questions, it is a maddeningly complex subject. Concrete answers prove elusive. Some researchers have accepted that media depictions of terrorism can influence the public, but not all the time, and not always to the same degree in respect of different members of that audience. That's unsurprising. It speaks to the fact that most people would not be affected directly by media reporting of terrorism any more than the reporting of suicide. But it isn't most people that I'm concerned about. We've seen just how vulnerable, confused, and disenfranchised some of our successful and would-be terrorists are. Extensive media coverage of terrorist events is understandable, given the public interest. But what is or is not featured in that coverage could inadvertently amplify that threat. For example, streaming footage from a scene provides a platform that many terrorists crave but would otherwise never achieve. Publishing terrorist manifestos provides context for some, but it's also justification and a trigger to act in the eyes of a vulnerable few. And signposting chat rooms might unwittingly lead tens of thousands of people to access material that otherwise would have only been seen by a handful. I don't underestimate the challenge of making those kind of editorial decisions on content, sourcing, and imagery in the white heat of a breaking story, a story that's going to dominate the news agenda worldwide and the public's insatiable demand for information and explanation. I hope you believe me when I say that I understand the demands of operating under that level of pressure and scrutiny. I truly do. They are judgment calls for you as the seniors. I don't question your good faith or your freedom to make those tricky decisions. But I do have a responsibility to do everything I can to prevent terrorism and minimize the risk of accidentally making this situation worse. I want to help you make those decisions by providing our expertise on terrorism in exactly the same way as the Samaritans provided theirs on suicide contagion. The public interest in terrorism will never cease. The public's expectations about how we talk about terrorism and what the material is or is not fit for mass consumption, well, that does change, and sometimes it changes very rapidly. Prime Minister Ardern's decision to not dignify the Christchurch killer with a name won global respect. It's not a static debate. It's another reason why we should build a partnership, you and I, as you have done with the Samaritans, that's two-way, based on evidence, and alive to the changes in public sentiment. And we in policing don't always get our communications right either. In 2016, after the 2015 Paris attacks, Mark Rowley and I asked for your help in getting it right. Our joint ability to warn and inform the public at the time of great threat relied on that partnership being very close. And you absolutely rose to that challenge in 2017. And it's a complicated challenge, where we always find ourselves looking through a glass darkly. What information should we release? How much detail? How quickly? How do we balance the need for reassurance against the need to be transparent about the threat? How do we avoid prejudicing an investigation by releasing wrong or excessive information as events are unfolding? Who are our customers? What do they really need, balanced against what they really want? And what about the dignity of victims, survivors, and communities who are directly affected, balanced against the need to work with the media to gain more information as quickly as possible? Those questions could be thrown at both of our professions. What do the public need to know in 5 minutes that will keep them safe? In 5 hours that will keep them informed? And in 5 days that will help them understand what's happened and try and return to normal? Where does the balance of public interest lie in all of those complicated questions? And Rob Irvin, editor of the Manchester Evening News at the time of the Arena attack in 2017, told us some of the responses to the way his team reported that horrific tragedy. Their readers and business partners, including advertisers, really respected the responsible way the attack was covered, with the paper prioritising those affected rather than focusing on the perpetrator. Many individuals and many of those business partners made significant contributions to the Manchester Evening News efforts to raise millions of pounds to help those affected. Rob certainly believes the Manchester Evening News reputation was enhanced by its approach to the tragic events of May 2017. Now, I believe, as many of you will, that there is a moral case to do this well, but Rob is also pointing out it makes good business sense too. And I know these are complex questions, and I don't have the answers, but I'm absolutely dedicated to working with you to get to them. And I've talked about what I want to achieve as a cop. I am fascinated by what you want to achieve as editors. I hope at some point in our future we will find common ground. I believe, as I've said, journalists and policing, common ground is not hard to find. So if I leave you with these questions, how can we, journalists and police, tenacious investigators and truth seekers, driven to prevent suffering, celebrate heroes, how can we work together in a true partnership to reduce the threat from terrorism? What small changes might we be prepared to make together in order to save more lives? And when I speak publicly, I often leave with one particular saying. It's a 19th century philosophy, and it'll be very familiar to you. Evil triumphs when good people do nothing. It seems apt today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Assistant Commissioner. That will give us all a lot to think about. Thank you very much indeed. Now, as I said beforehand, we've got a very short period of time for some questions from the floor. So if anyone wants to give us the usual show of hands, I'm going to play ringmaster, and then we're going to go for sort of like a group of questions, and let's see if we can get all the answers together. We've got one here, two here. I feel like I'm doing Treasure in the Attic.
Okay, I've got the floor. Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. It's Jim Watson from The Guardian here. I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit more, even with election sensitivities, on the leaking of the cables and the extent to which you were aware of that before publication, given your comments about other outlets also having them.
You've cited Auckland as Christchurch rather, as the most sort of egregious example of self-glorifying footage by a terrorist. Given the global nature of social media, what prospect or what hope do you have of any sort of international protocol to avoid repetition of that sort of self-glorification?
Thank you very much. And have we got another question to put in that cluster at this point? Oh, one right at the far back.
Yeah, you mentioned Christchurch. If it were up to you, would you ban the publication of images of terrorists completely in the UK?
Should we take those?
Those three.
The last one's easy because the answer's no. That isn't because I'm here to say I'm not here to censor the press. I think it would be a really bad thing to do. So banning the publication of terrorism, that's precisely not what I want. It is a type of reporting of terrorism. We don't, it is incredibly important that the public understands who these people are and what they're about and how they've come to be who they are and what they're trying to achieve in a way that lets us understand how pathetic most of it is. That's my view. And you can't do that by burying the truth. What I don't like is the fact that the images are constantly repeated or they're there for all eternity. So I saw a recent newscast which had a picture of Mwazi holding a knife to the throat of a hostage on mainstream news. To see that so many years after those horrific events, you can imagine the effect that that would have had on people. I don't think that was necessary as part of the story. So that's what I mean by it. But no, I would not seek to ban anything. It's the way things are reported, not the fact that they need to be reported, because they absolutely do. I'm doing these in reverse order for a very good reason. The second one about the social media, it is impossible to control social media for any of us. It just is. So I'm always optimistic. I always have hope. An international protocol amongst media across the globe, while my Five Eyes counterparts and I, we would love to see that happen. As Five Eyes seniors in counter-terrorism, those 5 countries, we are looking to influence social media. We do that alongside the government. We do that in private. We do that all of the time. I want that kind of relationship with mainstream media as well, where we can have sensible, mature conversations behind closed doors. I'm not an adversary here. I am absolutely a partner. How we can describe how we can help you report terrorism is what I'm after. Does it need an international protocol? I don't think so. You're a self-regulating body anyway. You've proven with the Samaritans you can do something in a different way. I think I'm trying to prove the fact that this might be another one of those occasions where it's worth contemplating that might make a difference. But that is not about being able to control social media. Social media is a huge competition for you, but what I firmly believe, I've no idea whether this is true, but you will know as a society and as an industry, I think there's a huge appetite amongst the public for news they can really believe in. And I don't think that's social media. So even my kids, who are teenagers, will often go to a mainstream media outlet that they know to check what they've read on some feed. And I think that's happening. I've certainly seen polling from people who advise the Met that is something that happens quite frequently. So I think there's still a market for the real people who produce real investigative, decent journalism, and I think they're represented in this room. I don't think it's broad social media. Sorry, I was trying to completely avoid the first question. The reason for avoiding it is, of course, it is still a live investigation. I think being asked what I knew in advance, I certainly knew that there was a plan to publish a document which I had senior legal advice was a criminal act. That's what I knew in advance. So my job was to stop that criminal act happening in my head. That's what it was. And there are ways and means of doing that. I think I would like a relationship with editors where we already knew each other before we had to have that conversation. That I could have picked up a phone and had that conversation. I'm just not sure that picking up the phone and having that conversation, which is what I didn't know is who had the document. I knew one organisation that had it, but I didn't know whether that was all over Fleet Street. So a difficult call. In retrospect, do I think it was the right call? It was the right call to try and intervene in a potential criminal act. That's my job. I'm not going to apologise for that. I've done it for nearly 3 decades, and I'm pretty good at it. Would I have done it in that way? No. I think I've said that quite clearly. And mainly because I am desperate to have a relationship with you that will help me fight terrorism.
Any further questions? Lady at the back. Jeremy there.
Hi, hello. I'm Kate Pounds from News Associates. Do you foresee a future where police are able to support journalists by providing training in how to diffuse and use the right language and reporting styles to diffuse and protect from terrorism rather than accidentally promoting and inflaming it?
Thank you very much. Question in front. On this side here, sorry. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Hi, hello. Jeremy Clifford from JPI Media. Interesting that you cited the Samaritans. We've worked closely with the Samaritans. In fact, we had them in talking to our editors. We designed a course which we then made all our journalists sit and take part in to understand the impact of their reporting. My comment really to you, and it's a bit of a challenge back, I think, is to you and your role, and also to the broader police issue as well, is that you need to develop trust. So, you know, I think you coming here and talking to us is really interesting, and you come across really well, and you've said that you want to develop that relationship. That relationship needs to go far broader across all newspapers and news industries for us to be able to trust that you are giving us information. Because traditionally the police hold on to that information for one reason or another, but if you talk to most editors in this room, they will say actually there isn't a great relationship based on trust. If you get trust, I think then you might be able to have that same sort of influence that we've had with the Samaritans.
Thank you very much. And we've time for one more question right in the centre here.
Phil Harding, journalist. Given the way that terrorism has developed over the years and become seemingly more random, is there any useful purpose served by the threat level now?
Kate, thank you very much for that question. I promise I didn't bring Kate here and plant her in the audience. And that is precisely what I'm here today to offer. So what I absolutely do want to do is expertise in policing and countering terrorism, sitting together with young journalists who will want to report on this, is understanding what works and what doesn't. That doesn't mean your journalists have to go and take that. It's advice, it's expert advice. That's what it is. But that's the utopia for me, that we get to a point where that happens. And it's a nice segue onto the second question, because I don't consider that a challenge. I consider that entirely reasonable. That is an entirely reasonable proposition. And bear in mind, I've been in policing for 27 years, virtually to the day. I first started doing extensive media in 2003. I've been doing this a long time, and I've had some fantastically trusting relationships with the media in which I have disclosed things that would have absolutely compromised an investigation without that trust, so that things could happen. And I mentioned, one case here. I've been both involved in the Lawrence inquiry, in charge of that investigation, and I currently line manage the senior officer who's still in charge of that investigation. That is incredibly close to my heart, not least as the most senior BAME police officer in the UK. That only came about, a challenge to my organisation, because we weren't what we should be. So I think that challenge, and I'm hoping it's in this speech, and you heard it loud and clear, is something we relish and we should be developing. But I don't want to do that through open letters or in open forum any more than you want me to do that. I'd much rather we were doing it by developing that relationship you want. And there was a time when we were really good at that. There was a time when, for certain individuals, it went too far. But they're individuals. That's not about our joint professions. That is precisely the relationship that policing and journalism must have, and has had as long as we've been around, to be frank. Looking at the fantastic history of this hall, we go back to 1829, and there was always a case for building that relationship. Always a case. Not least to gain public trust and confidence. The threat level. So what's interesting is, it's quite right that it's come down in some respects. You can't have a threat level that stays at the same level forever just because you think something is going to happen. That's not a sensible way to treat threat. So there's a very clearly defined literacy around the different threat levels. Obviously, JTAC, totally independent of anyone else, gets to look at absolutely everything when it decides where the threat level should be, and it should move up and down based on that analytical threat. I think the question is, it's so random now, how can you possibly judge? Well, it's not all random. I mean, what we mean by the volatility is that people are much quicker to be radicalised and much quicker to act, and it's much easier to hide their behaviour. But there's still plenty of intelligence to go on that gives us a judgment about how close we are or how we are not to an attack. So I think the threat level does serve a purpose. It also serves a purpose, obviously, to educate the public in what we want from the public to stay alert. And if we weren't issuing any kind of threat level, it would be incredibly difficult if you don't have a burning platform, which is an attack, in order to educate the public in what to look out for and how to stay alert. It's been a problem for decades in this country, fighting terrorism, is how do you keep people alert? It's hard enough to keep police officers alert when they are dealing with a multitude of threats, not just terrorism. So keeping the public there is what the threat level is about for me.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm afraid we have now run out of time. Can I thank you, Assistant Commissioner, for spending your time with us. Thank you for your frankness and your offer that once the election is out of the way, your phone is there to be rung and the conversation continue. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to thank the Assistant Commissioner.